Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Big Sky Now podcast. I am your host, Josh Amick, with my panel, Fritz, John, and Ian. This is a special FCS playoff kickoff edition episode, so we're going to get right into it. 5 teams in the Big Sky made it to the playoffs, with MSU, UC Davis, and Idaho all earning byes. Which team do we think is going to benefit the most from earning this bye? And we kind of talked about it last week, but are there any other surprises as far as the rankings go for any of these 5 teams, Ian?
I think since like week 2, we've been talking about injuries related to Idaho. So I'm going to stick with that here. Obviously, a bye for them is very important. They've got a couple of guys who missed the last game. On Tuesday's episode, Fritz mentioned defensive end Keyshawn James Newby, who has 9.5 sacks for the Vandals this season, didn't play against Idaho State, and they were also without their running backs Cummings and Buchanan. They've been able to move the ball pretty well without those guys over the last couple of weeks, but obviously you want those guys back, and hopefully another week of rest should be able to get them back in the game.
I think everybody is going to benefit, of course, from the week off. It's football, it's a physical sport, so who knows what nagging injuries teams may have. I feel like Fritz is going to touch a little bit more on Montana State in his time, so I'm going to focus a little bit more on UC Davis. I definitely agree with Ian, though, that Idaho definitely, with all the injuries that they've had, getting that extra week is going to be nice for them. For UC Davis, I think it's going to be a big thing just to kind of maybe get a little bit of rehab in for the guys who are high volume. I mentioned that in the last podcast, but Lan Larson and Miles Hastings, they use both those guys a ton. So just being able to kind of maybe make them 100% again, you never know what could be bothering them. So, yeah, but I mean, just anytime you can get a week off, especially going into some difficult opponents in the playoffs, it's going to be nice.
Yeah, I did want to hit Montana State a little bit because, I watched quite a few of their nice players limp off the field. And includes Julius Davis, who had 7 really good carries. I thought he was going to pop a couple of them for touchdowns. And when he rolled up 39 yards, his last carry, he limped off. Didn't look good. Vigan doesn't know for sure if he'll be back. Vigan did talk positively about getting Scott Humphrey back healthy in 2 weeks. Humphrey only had 1 carry on Saturday. Clearly, they didn't need him to carry a lot because the redshirt freshman Adam Jones was going off and winning National Player of the Week awards and entering the Jerry Rice Award watch list for top freshmen. So Idaho, obviously, MSU, maybe if people aren't paying attention, they need to get some kids healthy. Brody Grebe also left that game. That's the guy that wears number 41 for him, has been their top DN for quite a while, and he limped off and didn't return. And speaking of plug and play, the Bobcat defense and their running back crew has just been continuing to play really consistent, high-level football. So, I think I mentioned Tuesday, I'm not happy about Idaho being ranked or seeded as low as they are and having them and UC Davis and the Grizz on the same side of the bracket. I don't like it. To have an all Big Sky final, which has never happened, we'd have to see some serious upsets on the other side from Montana and NAU.
All right. So speaking of Montana, they are going to host Tennessee State. They're the latest game scheduled at an 8:15 kickoff. How big is not only just the home field advantage, but that late kickoff for Montana to get a win? And what other challenges are the Tigers facing heading into Montana, John?
I think that Tennessee State's definitely going to be riding the high, getting into the playoffs for the first time since 2013. Eddie George has done a good job, the former Titans running back, getting them into that position. Now they beat SEMO over the weekend 28-21. That kind of locked in their spot with a 9-3 record. I think that the 8:15 start time is also going to play a pretty big factor in this game. It's 10:15 over in Nashville will be the start time. If they're not prepared for it, that puts the game ending at about 2 a.m. their body clocks. So it's difficult to keep the body going for all that time. I seem to remember a game a few years ago where SEMO State also came up to Missoula, and they started out pretty hot against the Grizz, and the Grizz kind of wore them down, and by the end of the game Montana took control. So I think that was the week before. No, maybe not. Never mind. But I was thinking that might have been the week before that Eastern game, but nah, they wouldn't have been in the first round that year. But yeah, I do think that the time is going to be a big factor in this game. The home field is maybe not going to be as big of a factor because it's the weekend after Thanksgiving, and it's always a difficult game to get tickets sold to. It's usually about 20,000 compared to sold out 26,000. So, but yeah, we'll see what happens.
That's pretty optimistic.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, I think you're being optimistic. I think it'll be around 17,000 on Saturday. I imagine, as usual, this has happened a lot, even at home, or especially at home. Tennessee State will jump out. Grizz have been behind a lot of games this year, and then they seem to figure it out. Couple things stand out about the Tennessee State Tigers is, I think they had a 52-3 loss at NDSU early this year. They played a lot of running backs, so I think they've had some injuries there. The quarterback's tough. 2,700 yards, 22 TDs. His name's Draylon Ellis. They have a couple all-name kids, Boogie Trotter at running back, and the top receiver's name is Karate Brenson, which is awesome. But yeah, they come from the OVC, Ohio Valley. It hasn't been a great conference. There's 6 teams in the league. John mentioned it was first burst since 2013. In 2015, Jacksonville State made the title game with a really good team, and then they moved up to the FBS last season. And without Jacksonville State, I think the Ohio Valley's gotten a lot shallower, just not as deep a league, and I think the Grizz are going to be heavily favored. But I still imagine they'll fall behind at some point.
Yeah, John mentioned the time difference between Tennessee and Montana. I'm also just want to point out it's going to be about 27 degrees around kickoff on Saturday. I've been to Nashville plenty of times. I don't know if they're ready for that, especially this early in the year. It gets a little colder towards January and February, but a little bit different playing there in late November. But anyway, about Tennessee State, they've got kind of a middle of the pack offense in terms of offensive yards per game, but they do tend to throw it a little bit more than they do run it. And obviously we've seen Montana give up some big plays in the pass game this season. So they have to be alert for that on Saturday night.
So John is a little optimistic about the fan turnout, and Fritz is not optimistic about the possible first half for the Grizz. So we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully after the Thanksgiving weekend, things will turn around.
But neither John or I mentioned, Brandon Fisher is a former Grizz linebacker whose dad, Jeff, was the longtime Tennessee Titans coach. And Brandon is the DC for the Tigers. And I think it's also notable that they've given up more yards per rush, 3.9, than they've actually gained on offense, which is 3.5. Okay, I'm done talking.
No, that's a good point. They're going to need to stop the rush if they want to beat Montana. So we'll see. Should be a good game, though. Moving on to I think will be a really good game is NAU facing Abilene Christian. Abilene Christian seems to have a kind of tougher schedule throughout the year, but they both finished the year 8-4 wins. Fritz, you kind of teased this on Tuesday. Do we think NAU can go on the road and get this win, or do you think Abilene Christian should be the favorite team going into this weekend?
Well, I think Abilene Christian will be favored, but I just have a funny feeling that NAU can pull it off. Oddly, they've had 5 playoff games at this level, and they've won 1, and it was on the road at top-seeded McNeese. I don't think McNeese should have been top-seeded back then. That was 21 years ago, and I was covering the Grizz that year. And then, it's the first burst since 2017. They're 1-1 against the playoff field, but they beat Bubble Team and Utah Tech. I think Tech was kind of close to being in there, and I don't know. They barely beat Northern Colorado to start the year, and they just got walloped. They were down 32-6 in the third quarter to Stephen F. Austin and lost that game. And Stephen F. Austin didn't even have former Grizz quarterback Sam Vidlak in the lineup. So I don't know. I just don't think they're coming in with much momentum, and I think NAU is, and I think they can pull it off.
I actually agree. A little bit. It's kind of weird to face a non-conference opponent that also has 2 familiar games. Obviously, Abilene Christian played Northern Colorado and Idaho this season. Just kind of looking through their results, Abilene Christian plays a lot of close games, especially as of late. I think it's each of the last 3 games have all been one score. One of them was by 1 point. One of them was by a field goal. I'm expecting this one to be pretty close. It might come down to a field goal at the end or maybe even a little overtime. And like Fritz, I kind of agree. I think Northern Arizona is riding pretty high right now. Obviously had the comeback late in the game against Eastern last week to be able to punch their ticket into the playoffs. I think they're going to come in and I think they're going to win on Saturday.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to mention that no one has before is that Abilene Christian's quarterback got hurt in their last game against Stephen F. Austin. Maverick McIver, who's thrown for almost 3,700 yards and 29 touchdowns, left at halftime and didn't come back. So they have no updates on his status for this weekend at this point, which, it's college, so he could suit up and go out there and warm up. He could be in street clothes. We don't know what'll happen until, game day probably. So, but his backup in that game went 12 for 30 with 2 interceptions, 2 touchdowns, 187 yards, but they weren't able to pull off the second half comeback and drop that last game to Stephen F. Austin. So, I think if McIver is out there and healthy, it looks a lot better for Abilene Christian, but I definitely think this is going to be a tight game. Like Ian's mentioned, they've played a lot of close games all season. So, the one thing that I do worry about with NAU is going on the road. They've 3 road wins this season, came against Northern Colorado, Cal Poly, and Utah Tech, and those teams combined to go 5-30. So that's not ideal.
Yeah, they definitely don't have the Flagstaff home field advantage, and they won't have it the rest of the year. But I do think I love that you bring that up, John, because that's something I didn't know. Maybe the people at home didn't know. That could lead to NIU pulling off this win if they're not having their starter. Because you said 12 or 30. That's definitely not ideal for a quarterback in the FCS. But moving on to my favorite portion of the episode is our picks. Since the regular season came to an end, I do want to highlight the panel and all the great picks they made, because I think if you're a bettor and you're making these picks based off of what these guys were giving you every week, you would have been up quite a bit of money. So the person who led the leaderboard all year, I think there was only 1 week where he was either tied or not atop the leaderboard, was my man Fritz, who won 80 games. He was 80-15 in picking with the 842 win percentage. That's crazy. So congratulations to Fritz. Mark, who's resting up his leg, went 77-18. Ian was tied for second all year, but last week he picked Eastern, and that's what caused him to be 1 game less. So he went 76-19. John finished the season strong, winning going 6-0 in the last 2 weeks. So he finished with 75-20 record. And we don't need to talk about my record. My record was the worst, but it was it was my first year in the Big Sky, so I will get better. And it's my job to host, not my job to be part of the panel. So we're going to give you our picks for this week, and then we'll switch it over to just playoff picks since there is nothing else to go off of. So, Fritz, as always, kick us off with who you got this weekend for the playoffs.
Well, I'm at the risk of being a homer for the Big Sky. I'm picking NAU to beat Abilene Christian, and I'm picking the Grizz to beat the Tennessee State Tigers.
All right. Mark did not give me his picks this week, so I'll see if he can email them to me before Saturday. So, Ian, go ahead and tell us what you got.
Yeah, I won't be making up any ground this week. I'm also going with the Big Sky sweep. I've got Northern Arizona taking down Abilene Christian and Montana defeating Tennessee State.
This is my chance to be a little different. I've got Montana at home, of course, but I'm going to pick Abilene Christian at home as well. I think they'll take down NAU.
Well, I've been doing this all year, and that's being different, and it didn't work out for me. So this year, I'm going to go with the panel. I'm going to go with the Big Sky teams. I'm going to go with NAU and Montana. I think going into this episode, I had Abilene Christian winning until John gave me that little tidbit, and I think if you're missing your starting quarterback, unless you're Idaho, it's probably going to affect your team pretty heavily.
Right.
That's going to wrap up this episode of the Big Sky Now podcast. Join us next week when we hopefully should have 5 teams in the playoffs, with all 3 of those 5 teams getting their game next week. But I want to thank my panel, Fritz, John, and Ian. Hopefully we have Mark back next week. If not, Mark, take care, get better. We'll see you all next Tuesday on another episode of Big Sky Now. Thank you for joining us.